Hello, this is the sixth lesson of our history course, and in this I'm going to start looking at the economics portion of the specification. I'm sorry for that light, but as I'm sure everyone, quite frankly in England, knows, the sun starts going down really early in the winter and autumn, so this is my way of trying to keep recording for longer. I'm sorry if it makes everything look awful, but I suppose it's a necessary evil. We can split Lenin's economics into we can split it quite neatly into three sections. The first of which being in 1917, state capitalism. Sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, doesn't it? State capitalism, or at least if you know economics. What basically happened was the commanding heights of the economy, so stuff like transport, the transport, I've drawn a blank, stuff like banking. So key parts of the education, healthcare, those kind of things. They were nationalised by Lenin's government, and this was coming off the back of the Tsar's economic system, which was a feudal system, basically, where there were haves and have-nots, and if you didn't have anything, you were a bit screwed because there was nothing there to help you. There were the Vasenkas. I'm not quite sure, because it's a Russian word, I'm not sure if Vasenka is a singular or a plural, but you had the Vasenka. They were economic experts. Some of them were Tsarist, some of them were Bolsheviks. They were basically in charge, I've said basically a lot, but they were basically in charge of ensuring the smooth running of the economy. They were economic planners, basically, but because this was a free market of sorts, they weren't as heavily involved. When looking at state capitalism, it's important to remember that this was after the First World War and after the October Revolution. The First World War was one of the biggest economic shocks in the history of forever. The Bolshevik Revolution was an extreme economic shock. So this is an economy which has suffered shock after shock after shock, and Lenin desperately needs to bring stability after the revolution. This is very important because in 1917 there still is some form of democracy. Of course he would be sure to take that away later, but at this point he needs to ensure that people are supporting the Bolsheviks and that his regime is seen as a better regime than the one that they got rid of. Moving swiftly on to 1918, the Civil War happens. In this course, when you look at the politics, it greatly influences the economics. So once you've got that crucial underpinning of politics, you can begin to see how economics is going to unfold. The Civil War, Lenin needs to say, okay, let's stop messing around, let's get everything under control, and let's fight the whites. He does this by bringing in grain requisitioning under the policy of war communism, which basically, there's that word again, basically, which involved taking the grain off of peasants. There was no longer going to be a free market. You were going to produce as much as you could. You could have a little bit so you don't die, but aside from that, give it here. There was the nationalisation of practically all industries. This was to create as much arms and bombs and bullets as possible, because during a time of war, when your regime is as weak as Lenin's was in the early years of the revolution, you need to be very strong militarily, I guess. So the Red Army were constantly given supplies by the war economy in Moscow, for the most part. There was rationing of goods. They got rid of all currency, and people were paid paid in rations based on the jobs they did. Soldiers were paid the most. Then there were workers. Then there were like women and peasants, and the bourgeoisie got the crappy end of the stick even, and they ended up with the least. So there was this graded 4-3-2-1 system, this ratio almost of how much people get paid in the form of rations, that is. I'm sure you can imagine when there's a rationing system and your child is going hungry, you are going to take part in the black market, which began to start up around them. You also might do what 1.8 million workers did, and that is leave the cities and go to the countryside. Why? Well, in the city you need to work, but you need to wait for them to pay you. In the countryside, you go and help with the harvest, they give you some food. It's a more direct way of getting fed and not dying of hunger in Russia's cold winters. However, by the end of 21, it seems like even those who have gone to the fields in search of food probably aren't getting that much, because the 1921 harvest was only 46% of the 1913 harvest. This is incredibly problematic for Lenin. He has told everyone that his regime is going to be better than the Tsarist one, but it's still not doing as well and people are going hungry. What you're left with is a regime which is really quite unstable and which needs to take action to ensure it doesn't collapse. Here comes the 1921 Party Congress. Looking back at politics, this is when he introduced the decree on party unity. But the reason he introduced that decree was the resolution on party unity. The reason he made that resolution was in order to prop up the NEP. The NEP stands for the New Economic Policy. Not a very original name by Lenin. I guess he wasn't that creative. But the NEP was all about introducing a free market particularly for agriculture, but for the rest of society too. What is really important about the NEP was that it was brought on by Lenin's fear of the peasants just ruining everything by going to war. I've done a diagram before, I'll do it again. It's not a very useful diagram, but I guess it kind of shows my point. You've got the bourgeoisie at the top, workers here, peasants here. If the peasants get annoyed at you, you're quite screwed, because even if you've got the support of the workers, which to some extent Lenin had, but he'd also lost a great deal during war communism, and well, he's basically said to the bourgeoisie, you can go and die. You've not got many people who like you very much, and in a system where the peasants would literally just take up arms and kill all the Bolsheviks, you do not want them to be angry at you. That's why the NEP comes in. This is to end the civil war and to prevent the regime from being toppled. With the NEP came social change. One of the major characteristic of the NEP was the introduction of prostitution, the rise of gambling, a huge increase in unemployment. The gambling and the prostitution came because there was a free market now. People weren't fighting the war, so they could go and play dice or whatever. Largely, social change happened because you had a lot of soldiers coming back to Moscow and St. Petersburg or Petrograd. After fighting, you had people coming back from the fields to the cities, and there was no jobs available for them. This wasn't war communism where everyone's being put to work. Instead, it was a free market-ish, where if you weren't needed, you weren't employed, and if you weren't employed, you wouldn't have any money, and if you don't have any money, you go and start taking drugs and gambling and going out with prostitutes. It was a really dismal state of affairs socially for the NEP. There were some good sides though. The agricultural produce increased a great deal. So it went up by 30 million tonnes per year. Let me make sure I say that properly. The agricultural produce in 1920 was 30 million less than the agricultural produce in 1926. 30 million tonnes, that is. Think of all of the grain that is. And that is all because Lenin has decided to introduce a free market. At this point, farmers can produce, they can invest in new technology in the form of tractors and stuff, and they can keep producing more. There's an actual incentive for them to produce. That being said, I mean, although there was a 10% tax on all produce, that's not that much really, and it still allowed farmers to get quite rich. But things can never go well in the Soviet Union. 1923, we had the scissors crisis come into play. It's a term coined by Trotsky because there's a graph like this. And well, that's not actually true. There's a graph that looks like this. And he said it looked like the blade of a scissors. Why did I say a scissor? Of a pair of scissors. What was staying relatively low was the price of grain. What was staying relatively high was the price of mechanical goods, of industrially made goods. This was because it was much harder for Lenin to build new factories than it was to just get farmers to produce more. As a result, there was more supply of grain, the price went down, and farmers weren't getting as much for their grain. The massive downside to this is they can't just invest in more mechanically made goods, so tractors and fridges. I don't think they had fridges, but you know what I mean, luxury goods. They can't invest in them because the price is extortionately high, and in fact the supply of it is quite low. You had this issue where there wasn't much investment to keep producing because the price was so low and that there wasn't much to buy with the money that you actually had. Now, they kind of solved this by doing subsidies and just trying to get more factories open. The main difficulty was that they couldn't make new factories, but they could kind of reopen old factories. But it still wasn't really enough. And by 1927, it was a huge issue. This created the backdrop for the Great Industrialization debate. On the left of the party, you had Trotsky. He was saying that things were better here. On the right, you had people like Bukharin, who were saying things are better here. Then you had Stalin. He was a pragmatist. He said, things are better wherever people say they're better, and quite frankly, I'm going to kill you all in 10 to 20 years' time. So he didn't really engage in the debate so much because he was such a political schemer. He just saw where the debate was going and kind of reacted accordingly. By 1928, the NEP is dead, and that is something we will go on to in the next lesson. What changes then throughout this period of history? You have the shift from capitalism to supposed communism, let's call it extreme socialism, and capitalism again. So capitalism, communism, capitalism, I'm not going to give any prizes out for guessing where it goes next. There's a change in freedom of the economy. When I talk about freedom in an economy, I think I'm talking mainly about the freedom of privatization. So how much of the economy is nationalised, how much of it is left to the free market. Here, quite a lot is left to the free market. Here, nothing is left to the free market. Here, quite a lot is left to the free market. I've tried to show that with this graph. So you have control over time, goes up and peaks at war, communism comes down, and this is next lesson, Mr. Stalin. Finally, I'd like to raise the issue of necessity. Now, Lenin is a figure who, if you believe the communist propaganda, was a zealot. He was so passionate about ideology. He was a hard worker. He was almost a god because he was driving the country through to communism. I view it in a very different way. Lenin was ultimately led and driven by necessity. Whether or not that is what he wanted is irrelevant. He was driven and pushed by the realities of the situation at the time. 1917, state capitalism. Whoops. State capitalism. He has to start rebuilding the economy. And how does he think the best way to do that is? A free market. He even said it himself. He said he was building communism with capitalist hands. He was using the tools of the capitalists to rebuild his economy. Again, necessity. He has to take control of the economy through war communism. This is not different to anything that happened in Britain during the First World War and Second World War. Although there was currency, there was still rationing. Churchill and the wartime prime ministers, they had to control the economy and control output. People wouldn't be working for private industries anymore. They'd be working for the state to produce arms and produce things for the soldiers. And again, by necessity. This is not a choice Lenin has. If he chooses not to implement the NEP, if he chooses to stay with war communism, his regime would have collapsed. War communism could only work when there was enough resources going around to ensure that nobody was hungry. But even then it probably wouldn't work because people they wanted luxuries, and that is the main thing with the NEP. It gave people the opportunity, mainly farmers, to push for luxuries. And so, when looking at the economics of Lenin, the ideological argument begins to fall apart. He cannot, as a leader of the Soviet Union, he cannot make all his decisions based on ideology. Instead, in my opinion, it is necessity which drives him more than anything else. I hope this video has been useful. Please like it if you liked it. Please dislike it if you didn't like it. And remember, you can stick around to get more content. I hope to see you again next time.